For their inspirational calls to action, let me thank our new leaders, Annalise, Angela and Keir, the next Labour Chancellor, the next Labour Deputy Prime Minister and the next Labour Prime Minister. And you know, leadership always matters, but it matters now more than ever. Real leadership is the difference between jobs saved and jobs lost, between a flourishing economy or boarded up streets. And today, leadership is also the difference between lives saved and lives lost, between an NHS flattening the curve or facing a surging pandemic. Friends, my eyesight was saved by the NHS. My son's health saved, surrounded by the wonderful care of the NHS. And we stand with millions of families around our country who depend for our lives on the NHS, who, like me, could not address you today without first thanking all NHS, social care, public service and emergency workers who day after day continue to risk their lives to save our lives, and who need not just proper recognition by us clapping our hands, but fair remuneration by us raising their pay. And the NHS is what solidarity and working together is all about. We stand with each other, for no matter where you live in the UK, no matter your income, no matter your illness, the NHS is there when you need it, inspired by the same solidarity, the same shared values that must now shape the National Care Service it is Labour's destiny to build. And I'm here today to propose how through that solidarity and the same spirit of cooperation, all our nations, regions and communities can come together to wage and to win the coming war against unemployment. For mass unemployment is not inevitable. It is not an act of God. It does not follow unavoidably from COVID-19. It depends on the choices governments make. Yet this winter, unemployment is heading towards 3 million, up to 10%. And despite us all saying Black Lives Matter, black jobs don't seem to this government to matter, as BAME unemployment moves up to 20%. Youth unemployment, 30%. Amongst 18, 19-year-olds not in education to 40, even 50%. Look round the country, 1,000 applicants for just one receptionist job in London. 1,500 chasing only one admin job in Coventry. 15,000 desperate for just 10 assembly jobs on offer in Birmingham. 2,653 seeking a single factory job in Sunderland. 2,932 in Northumberland for one warehouse job. Almost as likely to win the national lottery than this jobs lottery. The odds more than 2,000 to 1 against finding a job, the worst odds for 50 years. And what a tragic waste of lives, when there is more talent today on the breadline in Britain and in the boardrooms of Britain, and when the north-south divide is not narrowing, but growing fast. This is not the levelling up we were promised. I tell you what it is: unemployment up, poverty up, deprivation up, homelessness up. Boris Johnson told us his team would spend more time in the north, but you know, only one of them has spent any time in the north, Dominic Cummings, and he didn't level up either. One rule for them, another rule for you. One rule for the Downing Street elite, another for you. One rule for the grouse-moose set able to meet, another for grieving families unable to meet. And so it falls to Labour to bring a divided country together and to make hope come alive. You know, for me, solidarity is feeling the pain of others. Solidarity is believing in something bigger than yourself. If just one or two of us came together, we might achieve little. But when as now, 1,500 Labour councillors, led by real Labour leaders, the Metro Mayors of Bristol, Manchester, Newcastle, Sheffield and Liverpool City regions and London, come together with Keir, the unions and employers in our new Alliance for Full Employment, demanding a new recovery plan within days, to extend furlough where it's needed, guarantee work to the young who need it, build new infrastructure and a Green New Deal in areas where it's needed. Just think of the change we can achieve by working together. And you know, this Alliance for Full Employment matters for Scotland. For I speak to you as a proud, patriotic Scot, who sees the future not as Scots versus English, nor Scots versus Welsh, not as us versus them, but as we, the people, all nations and communities in this island moving forward in solidarity together. For I tell you, none of us anywhere can feel at ease when in any of our 4 nations, millions of elderly are ill at ease. None of us can be comfortable when any nation, millions of children are living without comfort. And you know, the biggest voting bloc in Scotland is not the 45% who voted for separation from the UK. The biggest is the 75% who want cooperation with the UK, who want Scotland and the UK to work together, not in perpetual conflict. You know, people know you can't solve a pandemic with perpetual conflict. You can't solve climate change with perpetual conflict. You can't solve poverty with perpetual conflict, but only through cooperation, solidarity, and working together. For let me tell the truth about Scotland that the SNP won't. That our enemy is not England. Our enemy is poverty, deprivation, homelessness, and squalor. The freedom the people of Scotland seek is not from the UK, but from injustice and from inequality. Changing the border is not what motivates us. It is changing society. So let us show people our vision of a united Britain, built not on the shifting sands of warring nationalisms, but on the unbreakable rock of solidarity and a willingness to share. United, all of us, around the same guarantee everywhere to every family of a rising living wage, improved child benefits and childcare, decent pensions, a free NHS and education, the costs and the benefits shared by all, the real universal basic income guaranteed to all the citizens of all the UK. And because I believe that inequality would last until doomsday if nationalism is what confronts it, we will fight and fight and fight again so that Scotland leads in the UK, not leaves the UK. And it's this same sense of solidarity, the same commitment to cooperation that is needed across the world today. As in every single country, we fight the same virus, the same recession, and face the same truth, that we cannot eradicate COVID-19 in any country, finally, if we do not eradicate it in every country. Yet with aid being cut, vaccine nationalism rampant, debt relief denied, DFID abolished, international cooperation at a post-war low, it is time to call for an end to the years of America first, of Russia first, of China first, of India first, and while respecting national loyalty, start to put international cooperation first, solidarity first, and make hope come alive. You know, hope dies when aid for the poor dries up and hospitals don't have the medicine they need to save lives. Hope dies when the world stands aloof when, as today, refugee boats capsize at sea. Hope dies when food convoys can't get through to starving towns. And hope also dies when millions of our fellow human beings can't plan and prepare for the future, and even begin to dream of a life full of opportunity ahead. It's said you can survive for 40 days without food, 8 days without water, 8 minutes without air, but not for a second without hope. Hope is what we, the Labour movement, offer. Hope, making what seems impossible possible, is what takes us from who we are to what we have it in ourselves to become. Hope is the bridge that takes our society from what is to what it can be. And have we not now learned from this crisis a basic, unforgettable truth that we make our world more secure when we come to the aid of the insecure, our society richer when we come to the aid of the poorer, all our communities more powerful when we include all those excluded from power? For is not the foundation of what we believe that when the strong help the weak, it makes us all stronger? And that's why I'm delighted to introduce our panel. Great leaders, great internationalists, who never have stopped believing we can create a better world. Lisa Nandy, Frances O'Grady, both of whom you know very well. And with them, my friend, the Finance Minister and Deputy Chancellor of Germany, and we all hope the next Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz.
Good afternoon. My name is Lionel Barber. I'm a writer and broadcaster and was editor of the Financial Times between 2005 and 2020. It's a great pleasure to moderate this discussion, and I'd like to introduce first Olaf Scholz, as Gordon says, formerly Mayor of Hamburg, Finance Minister and Chancellor candidate for the Social Democratic Party in Germany. Olaf.
Thank you. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to take part in this discussion, and I'm grateful to UK Labour for making it happen. I especially want to thank Keir Starmer for inviting me to this panel. All of us connecting digitally is perhaps a perfect example of our new normal, is perhaps a perfect example for the pandemic changing the world. Politics is very different these days too. We have to take enormously consequential decisions, often within a relatively short period of time and with a limited amount of information. From the beginning of the corona pandemic, our goal was to stabilize the economy, secure jobs, support companies and the self-employed, help families, support local authorities and consolidate the health system. The federal government decided very quickly to act immediately and extensively. Our early and decisive measures to stabilize our economy in March and to stimulate the economy in the summer are apparently working better than we could have hoped. One of our key instruments is Kurzarbeit, what you call Corona Job Retention Scheme. This helps us very much to save jobs during the crisis, as it did in 2008, and we now decided that we will continue with Kurzarbeit, with this job retention scheme up to the end of the next year to give security for the employers and the employees. Our economy's figures are slowly improving again. It was right that we acted so quickly with an economic stimulus plan and 2 supplementary budgets. This also includes new borrowing of 280 billion euros. It was important to react efficiently to the corona crisis and not to approach the matter bit by bit, because it was our goal to turn around the trend quickly. In this crisis, Europe is living up to its core principle of solidarity. The characteristics that define our European model of democracy are also our best assets in the fight against the pandemic and its economic fallout. With a strong role for responsible government, with a guarantee of social security and with an emphasis on solidarity, we can weather this storm. It was only in April that the Eurogroup agreed on a 540 billion euro safety net to protect workers, businesses and states. Now we are working out the details of our 750 billion euro recovery program to get Europe's economy going again. For recovery to be truly successful, we must recover together and use this opportunity to transform our economy. To get Europe's economy back on track, investment is key. Coupled with smart, credible reform packages, it can create growth opportunities and make our economies more resilient. But to have a lasting positive effect, it must also be the right kind of investment. I'm talking about ecological and digital transformation, about making sure that Europe and its economy are fit for the 20th of this century. That is why I have pushed for an ambitious, cohesive and transformative recovery program. We have spelled out such a program in a joint Franco-German proposal, and now with Next Generation EU and its recovery and resilience facility, we have a program on the table that has been agreed by all member states. Put together, the safety net and the recovery program elevate Europe's common financial policy to a completely new level, a level that moves us closer to a fiscal union. Achieving a fiscal union will complete the economic and monetary union we already have. This way, we can increase the stability of financial markets. We can strengthen the role of the euro, putting it on a similar level, the US dollar, in a way that reflects our economic weight as the world's largest trading bloc. We can ensure our financial independence and thereby our sovereignty. For me, a strong and united Europe is Germany's primary national interest. And a strong EU needs a close partnership with Great Britain, because only together we can master the challenges that Europe will have to face in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olaf, and thank you for referring to the need for a strong partnership with Great Britain for the UK. I'm now going to turn to Frances O'Grady. Everybody knows Frances. TUC General Secretary since 2013 and the first woman to hold that post. Frances, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks to Lisa and Keir for the invitation. And my goodness me, listening to Gordon Brown is a reminder, I think, of what quality leadership means and how much we need that leadership at an international level. For our part, the trade union movement is an international movement, and I think it's time for a new internationalism. In the UK, we've been arguing hard that the government shouldn't just pull the plug on furlough and see good jobs go to the wall, but instead we want to see a job protection and upskilling scheme that protects jobs that do have a viable future but need support to get there, and uses downtime for skilling and retraining and investment in our future. So we're pressing hard on that, but we're also pressing for job creation, and the test for us is about jobs that have a green benefit and or a community benefit. And again, there is so much good work that needs to be done in Britain, so many vacancies in our public services, in social care, the NHS, local government that still need to be filled, and green infrastructure and transport for the future, because we still face not just coronavirus as a challenge, but climate change and so many other challenges too. But perhaps the biggest root challenge we face is deep inequality within countries and between countries. And we need international action to tackle that. I'm very clear there can be no going back to business as usual. There is no greater metaphor for this virus for me than seeing social care workers on agency contracts paid the national minimum wage, mostly women, very often born in other countries, taking the virus, spreading it from home to home because they're on those insecure contracts and low pay, and very often couldn't even afford to take time off sick when they needed to. So there is something that's gone fundamentally wrong when some of the most important jobs in society are paid the worst, and those doing them are treated without the respect that, my goodness me, they have earned. Just one thought from me. I was looking back on the ILO, the labour arm of the United Nations, in the Philadelphia Declaration from 1944. And I find that really inspiring. It talked about how lasting peace can only be established if it's based on social justice. It talked about an international commitment to full employment, rising living standards, fair shares of wealth, trade union rights and collective bargaining, welfare, maternity, recreation and culture for all. That was an inspiring vision born of tough times. And it makes me question what our vision could and should be as we emerge from this crisis at some point. What are the new rules? What are the new international rules? What's the new social contract that we want to put in place? Currently, we have a government that appears not to respect the rule of law, and we've seen where that takes us. In my view, they've surrendered moral leadership. They have trashed good faith discussions with the EU and other countries that we want to trade with in the future. And critically, they have destabilized the Good Friday Agreement, which, it took decades to build to win the peace. I think a lot of this is about trust. There cannot be one rule for the few and another rule for everybody else. But it's also about the role that all of us must play in creating that new social contract that does deliver fair shares, that does deliver decent work and a voice for working people. We want to play our part. We believe there is hope for the future, and we can only win that if we cooperate internationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frances. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary and MP for Wigan since 2010.
Friends, what a privilege to address you for the first time as your shadow Foreign Secretary. It's deeply personal to me. Decades before I was born, before my parents even met, a campaign fought by the Indian independence movement had devastating consequences for the Lancashire textile workers. My family in Lancashire and in India lived out both sides of that struggle. And despite the huge costs, they refused to allow it to divide them because they knew it wasn't working people in India or in Lancashire who were to blame. The system exploited both. So when Gandhi visited Lancashire, members of my family were among those who welcomed him. They knew that solidarity amongst working people is the answer, never the problem, and that their struggle was one and the same. That is why, as the first Shadow Foreign Secretary in almost half a century to address our party in a Britain that stands outside the European Union, I want to tell you that we will always be a proudly internationalist party. The socialism I believe in is one that looks beyond national borders. And after a divisive few years, we will recover our ambition, look to the future and lay out a vision of a country that is proud, open, self-confident and ambitious for working class people here and across the world, as we've done before once in our history after the Second World War. But to remember our history is not the same as to be bound by it. Mine is a generation that came of age in an era when decisive intervention from the Labour government saved countless lives in Sierra Leone. But we found our political voice when we marched against the Iraq War, seeing, as we did so clearly, that our generation would live with those consequences for decades to come. And as we turn now towards the future, we can no more afford to be bound by a nostalgia for what we did right than we can afford to be frozen by the fear of repeating the mistakes of the past. Because the world we'll inherit is infinitely more complex and challenging than the past. The certainties of the Cold War era are over. There is no global challenge that can be solved without the world's superpowers, and yet our allies in some fights pose great challenges to us in others. We live in a world where the click of a button on one side of the world can change lives on the other. And while COVID-19 demands the world pull together, the insecurity of the age has led to a rise in strongman leaders who peddle hate and fear. Now, in a world spinning out of control, our anchor is our values, the values that the Attlee government used to anchor a world reeling from war, human rights, democracy, free speech, and the rule of law. But new times require new priorities. So to this list, we will add new values of human security, feminism, and environmentalism at the core of our approach. In short, we will build a foreign policy fit for the realities of this century, not the circumstances of the last. Now, nowhere is that more important than security. Keeping the nation safe is the first job of any government. And the greatest threats to our security are global threats. They include amongst them the economic insecurity that afflicts families here and across the world. Throughout history, it's been in times of insecurity that we have lost the ability to understand one another. So when the Director General of the World Health Organization says that the biggest challenge we now face is not the virus itself, but the lack of leadership and solidarity globally and locally, we should respond. Just like those in India and in Lancashire who saw the danger of allowing themselves to be divided and chose to stand together all those years ago. So we must stand with the exploited garment workers in Bangladesh and the low-paid workers in Britain who rely on cheap clothes for their families. And when I tell you that we will always put the interests of the British people first, that is a commitment to internationalism that is rooted in an understanding that working people's interests are bound together and a belief that things can and must change. That is why leaders like Jacinda Ardern are taking action on climate change that shames this Tory government. Her government has become the first in the world to rein in the global financial risks created by climate change, because it is not only the poorest abroad who suffer from inaction on the climate emergency, but working class people in New Zealand and Britain whose pensions and savings are bound up in fossil fuels and who stand to lose most if we don't act now. Labour has learnt the hard way that our actions abroad must be built on the consent of people at home. And my pledge as Foreign Secretary is that we will build that support by rooting our foreign policy once again in the interests of working people here and across the world. If globalisation isn't working for them, it isn't working at all. Now, the Tories have not learnt this lesson as they set about tearing up friendships, breaking our promises, smashing our moral compass. But I have news for Boris Johnson and his friends. The people may not have had your privileges, but they are smarter than you. And when they told me stories of the struggles in India and in Lancashire, that is the lesson my family taught me too. It will never be in Britain's interests to retreat from the world. They could see it then, and we can see it now. To undo the Tories' lost decade, we need a different sort of leadership. And from Denmark to New Zealand, there are leaders who are showing the way. Leaders who know that compromise is not cowardice, with the courage to be honest and the self-confidence to change your mind. So we can go out and shed light, not might, around the world. To fly the pride flag at our embassies in countries where simply loving who you love is a crime. To stand with those brave young people in Hong Kong and the Black Lives Matter activists in the USA, and to match the courage of the women of Belarus as they put everything on the line in their fearless defence of freedom. And so the world becomes stronger, more secure, and hope burns a little brighter because of who we are and what we do. That is the country I've believed in all my life but never yet seen. And this is my promise to you as your Foreign Secretary. We will break with the past and we will build the future together. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me just make clear to everyone that we had hoped to have Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, but she has an election commitment. So first, Gordon, can I turn to you? One of the hallmarks of your premiership, and I remember it so well, in 2008-9 was an international coordinated response to the global financial crisis. And you memorably cited the failure in July 1933 at the London conference not to take action. You did get a consensus with Nicolas Sarkozy in 2009. Why haven't we seen that coordinated response to the COVID pandemic?
I think there's a very simple answer: nationalism. We've, if you like, got an international coalition of anti-internationalists. We've got an American president who doesn't seem to understand that in a unipolar age, America acted multilaterally, and now we're in a multipolar age, America acts in a unilateral way. And you know, that breaking point poster in 2016 during the European referendum, the day that Joe Cox was murdered, that was so obnoxious, I've seen that poster in other countries used as an attempt to breed nationalist sentiment, to try and weaponize economic insecurity in the interest of nationalism, and of course to defy the need for international cooperation. But you've just had three great speeches from Francis, from Lisa, and from Olaf that emphasize the importance of cooperation and solidarity. It's a human instinct. There is a need to cooperate, and we cooperate out of need, but there is also a human need to cooperate. And it's about national economic interests. Prosperity to be sustained in this world has got to be shared. And you only need to look at what's happening on the virus, you need to look what's happening on nuclear proliferation, you need to look what's happening on climate change to know that we cannot solve these global problems and get to global solutions without working together. So I think our speakers have shown this: cooperation and solidarity. Let's fight nationalism.
Olaf, would you like to just come in from the German standpoint? Europe has stood fairly closely together during this crisis. Then I'll come to Francis and Lisa.
There's really a change to the developments we had 10 years ago. During the financial crisis, it was quite difficult to give an answer which was a common answer in many questions. And this was even more so when we had the crisis with some member states that were not able to really organize their state financing situation. And today we give a common answer which really worked from the beginning, because just when we started to say that there will be an answer organized by the finance ministers with the 540 billion package, the markets reacted. And no single country became difficulties in financing the needs for their own activities. And this is even more so after we now decided on the recovery package. My view is that anyone understood that only a common reaction could be successful in a crisis that is a global crisis, and especially a crisis that hurts any member state of the European Union. And so I think that those are right that say that this is a pandemic, it is a catastrophe to mankind, and that we are all just able to react if we do it together. There is nothing which could be done just by one country. And those nations that think that they could stay it alone are wrong. And these people in our societies who still believe that it is not a good cooperation within this society, that it is not cohesion that helps us out of these difficult times, are also wrong. And this is the lesson that people learn.
Lisa, the UK has been hit particularly hard by this COVID pandemic. I wonder, what lessons do you think we in this country can draw from the experience of other countries, both in terms of mitigating the economic and public health impact?
If you look around the world, the countries that have been more successful than we have had leaders who have been honest with the public and unafraid to say when they don't know the answers, unafraid to show that they change their mind when the evidence changes, unafraid to be clear with people, to share that information and to try and take people with you. One of the first leaders that we met was Keir and I, when I was first appointed to this post, was Jacinda Ardern, who apologises hugely for not being able to be here, but she's got a leaders debate tonight and we are very keen that she wins that debate and that contest and continues to do such great work and fly the flag for hope for the world. But she said to Keir and I that, she said she reached out to the British people in very similar ways that Francis often reaches out to people around this country. And she said, you may not be at work, but you still have a job to do. And in doing so, she brought people with her on that journey to defeat the virus. Now, Gordon was typically modest when he answered the question about the difference between the financial crisis and now. But the huge difference, I think, between then and now is leadership. When Keir and I have been Zooming with world leaders, his name comes up over and over again. The last Labour government, led by Gordon Brown during the financial crisis, brought the world together and helped people to understand that it was in every country's interest, perhaps to give a little in order to gain a lot. And that is what is missing right now. And with the US having stepped outside of that leadership role, there is a real need for countries like Britain and Germany to come together and step forward together. But at precisely that moment, the British government has chosen to trash our relationships around the world. And that is why Labour is determined that we will be participants, not just spectators, in the battle that is to come and help to bring the world together. It's why we stayed within the progressive grouping, the Party of European Socialists, and why we've reached out to leaders across the world over recent weeks and months. And we will continue to do that. And we will continue to stand up for global cooperation, because that in the end is in the interests of the British people too.
Yeah, you're quite right, Lisa. I keep telling Gordon he's got to stop being so modest. Francis, as you know, there's a bestseller in this country, written actually by a friend of mine, called Why Germany Does It Better. Do you think that we could learn a few lessons from German economic policy? And I am particularly picking up on what Olaf said about Kurzarbeit, the short working, which was introduced also during the financial crisis.
Well, that was something that we pushed very hard with this government. So we were learning lessons from Germany and other countries too. And of course, one of the great traditions in Germany, which Ernie Bevan, in fact, had quite a hand in introducing after the war, was that notion of co-determination, of equal seats around the table, and that, not all good ideas come out of the boardroom or Westminster. You'll find quite a lot of good ideas coming out from the shop floor too. So what helps is to have a framework where it's possible to exchange those ideas. I think people know the union movement has a long track record that if there's a crisis, we'll step up, we'll put our shoulders to the wheel, but there has to be some acknowledgement that, you know, workers can't be expected to pay the price for this crisis in the way that we have for previous ones. And that isn't just an issue in this country. The ITUC, our international body, did a great big poll all around the world. Workers worldwide are saying the same thing. You know, we've seen our wages hammered, we've seen our job prospects hurt. We just want decent work, enough money to raise our children, and decent public services that hold us together as communities. It sounds to me it's not a lot to ask, but we will need to see a real readiness to shift power and indeed wealth a little bit more fairly in this country and around the world if we're going to win that New Deal that working people want.
Gordon, you were a reforming Chancellor and indeed a reforming Prime Minister, even in crisis. Why is it, having spent so much money on the national health system, that we don't have an effective track and trace in this country?
I don't think the government saw it as the priority right at the beginning. I think they went into a different idea for a while of herd immunity. I think they wasted the chance then to get testing underway so that we were testing very few people for a long time. Now we're testing more people, but the track system has not been got up. And so we have really failed to organize in the way. You see, I see government as you've got to be at least 2 steps ahead of the problem. You can't operate by just having press conference every day and dealing with the issue of the day. You've got to operate by looking ahead. What's the problem going to be? You could have seen this a mile away, that we would have to test millions and millions of people, and this is true over the next year. And that's what should have been introduced. And then it's the management of that by bringing everybody together. I think in this government, there are too many empires around the place and nobody is actually cooperating in the way they should. So it's an organizational problem, but you've got to start by getting to the root of the problem. In 2009, the problem was capitalism without capital. The banks did not have capital, and we had to get to the root of that problem. Here, if you don't have a vaccine, and we don't have a vaccine, and you don't have a cure, then you have got to test. That's the only way you can protect people, by knowing who's got the disease and knowing that you can track them once you've tested them. So that is the failure. It's organizational, but it starts from not identifying the root problem, and we should have done that. Now, around the world, I think people have been more sophisticated in what they're doing, and we can learn from Germany, we can learn from Korea, we can learn from other countries around the world. And this is one of the points that I think Lisa and Francis made. We've got to learn from other countries. This part-time work that is introduced by Olaf is one way forward for Britain. And I would say if we don't do something in the next few days, we're going to have a tsunami of job losses after October the 31st, because the furlough ends and there's really nothing in its place. So let's look at the German and French system, where they've got part-time support for part-time work, making up the wages so that people have a decent income.
Gordon, let me just quickly follow up on that, because Olaf, and I will come to him, said that the German government is actually going to extend the Kurzarbeit until the end of next year. Could we afford to do that in this country?
Well, it's true that we spent a huge amount of money in the first 6 months, and the German recovery program is about 130 billion euros, the French about 100 billion, America's debating $1 trillion to $2 trillion, a huge amount, and our program is about 50 billion. We were going to have to spend more. I think you've got to look at specific sectors now, and you've got to look at specific areas. Where there's local lockdowns, you've got to make up the wages. Yes, I think there are going to have to be part-time wage subsidies for quite a long period of time.
Olaf, with these record low interest rates, I mean, is it true that we can just borrow, no fear of inflation, and just have a bridge for, say, 2 years and then come back with no real pain? Or are you a bit worried about the bill for dealing with this pandemic?
We have a very solid financial situation in Germany. As you know, we reduced the debt to GDP ratio down under 60% in the end of the last year. And this is the basis for us to invest a lot to fight against the crisis. And I decided very early that we will spend a lot of money this year and the next year. We will have the next budget for the next year now in the cabinet tomorrow, and we will decide about taking new debt and reaching near to 100 billion euros, which is saying that we are still continuing with fighting against the crisis. My experience with Kurzarbeit, for instance, was very successful in the last crisis. I was the Minister of Labor then, and convinced anyone in Germany that we should try to use this instrument, which was drawn for specific problems for specific companies, as something which could be a reaction of the whole economy to a crisis like this one. And it was very difficult at that time to convince anyone that we also enlarge it up to 2 years, right in the beginning of the crisis, to give a message to the companies that they can be sure that the government will stay with them during the whole crisis. I think this is important. The employers take decisions any day, and they don't know what will be the next development in this crisis this year or the beginning of the next year. So they need a message that if they are taking the risk of staying together with their employees, that they can do so without a risk coming up later. And this is what we do. And as we have had this experience in the last crisis, and anyone also on the international level said it was working very well, I think we could be courageous enough to do it again. And you see that in many countries of the world, this short-term allowance schemes, the Kurzarbeit, as we call it in Germany, is used now. We have it as a program of the European Union called SURE, supporting countries doing so. So any member state can do. We see it in many other countries doing the same. And this is not astonishing, because after the last crisis, the International Labour Organization, the OECD, and the IMF all together said this is the best way to react to a crisis, making it possible for corporates that they keep to their workers. And I think this is one important aspect. To your question, yes, we can afford to do so because of the sustainable situation we already have. Yes, we can afford to do so because the interest rates are very low for government bonds. And yes, we are absolutely clear that after the crisis, we will go back to something which is a course of stability. But if you are doing something which is a Keynesian political strategy in the economy, you really have to be solid in good times and to be very aggressive fighting against the crisis in bad times.
Olaf, you must feel a little bit of schadenfreude, having received a lot of criticism along with your predecessor, Wolfgang Schäuble, for being so responsible on your paying down the debt and reducing the deficit. And in fact, this has allowed you to be in a strong position in 2019-20 to pay to tackle the pandemic. But you don't have to answer about schadenfreude.
I don't have a mood like this.
But I want to ask Lisa and then Francis about the dilemma, at least the challenge for the centre left. Because we know that this pandemic, Gordon's indicated, you too, Lisa and Francis, that this pandemic is going to actually, in the short term, increase inequality. And the populist virus took hold in the teens. Maybe it was fought back in France and Germany, but it's still there. And are you not worried that the centre-left could be a victim of a new surge of populism going forward? And what do you do about that? First, Lisa.
Yeah, of course, it's something that has occupied me, Keir, and all the progressive leaders that we've been speaking to over the last few months, about how we get the world to come together and how we build solidarity in an age of great insecurity. It's the great challenge of our times. And if you look across the world, you can see already that those forces are at work. In some countries, those strongman populist leaders are already attacking global institutions, scapegoating migrants, closing borders, and scrambling for a vaccine. We've seen a rise in vaccine nationalism around the world. And even in countries where those leaders aren't in power, you can see that there are key actors in the political arena China who are seeking to drive the discourse in that country in that direction. I mean, my view is twofold. Firstly, that we have to come together to make and win the counter argument. And even in opposition, we can be participants, not just spectators in that battle. That is why Keir has invested so much time since he became leader in reaching out to other leaders with me and beyond leaders as well, to trade unionists. Frances and her colleagues have been enormously helpful in plugging us in to the international trade union movement so that we can build common cause with working people across the world in order to make the counter argument, in order to hold our governments to account and force them to go out and cooperate with one another for the common good. But secondly, I think you have to look at the long-term trends behind some of this. And you alluded to it in your question, Lionel. This is not a new phenomenon. In Wigan, where I live and have lived for over a decade, we saw a collapse in support for Labour that started in the early 2000s, a sudden and dramatic rise in support for UKIP. Then we saw this huge vote to leave the European Union in a town that has consistently rejected far-right, openly racist parties for years and years. What lies behind it? It's insecurity. It's 40 years of economic decline. And that's why I said when I became Shadow Foreign Secretary that the left needs a more sophisticated approach. It's not enough to rail against those strongman populist leaders. We need to understand what drives workers in the Rust Belt to turn away from the Democrats and towards Donald Trump, in the same way as we need to understand what is driving those changes in the United Kingdom and in England in particular. And that's why Keir said today that security, not just national security, but economic security, family security, is going to be at the heart of the mission of the next Labour government, because we'll never pander to that populism and we certainly won't fuel it. But we will seek to understand the conditions in which fear and hate can take hold, and we'll seek to extinguish those conditions and tackle this at the root.
Frances.
I think the first thing I would say is that there is nothing inevitable about deepening inequality. You know, there are political choices to be made when it comes to how we regulate tech giants, how we regulate private equity, whether we think trade unionism and collectivism is a good thing or not. You know, there are choices to be made, and I think this government will be judged on the choices it takes. The second point I would make is that the biggest enemy we face is the threat of mass unemployment. And that's why I feel so passionately that it's a responsibility on government shoulders, on all of our shoulders, to do everything we can, including the use of short-time working schemes, to prevent mass unemployment. People seem to have short memories in this government, but those of us who lived through the 80s, those of us who had parents who survived through the 1930s, know the impact of poverty, of worklessness, what it means for the dignity not just of families, but of whole communities when a big employer goes bust, what that does to a town. So we have to do everything we can to keep people in work, because it makes economic sense too, as we've heard. That's the quickest way to work our way through this crisis and come out the other end, deliver hopefully greener, fairer growth that will fund our public services. And thirdly, I would say that another reason why we must fight for every job is because we know that that ugly face of right-wing populism takes root when people are scared and divided against each other. And I think we can push back against that. The TUC has made anti-racism one of our biggest strategic priorities over the next period. And it was great to hear Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, say that that's the case for Labour too. Because I think often, in fact, there's a very unfair, like almost stereotyping of working class people, that all working class people who are white are racist. And it is just not true in my experience. And in fact, you know, when I go around workplaces and when I talk to people, if you put it really simply, that it doesn't matter of what your race or religion or your background is, all of us want decent work, secure contracts, fair rewards, and the chance to have our voice heard. You know, people respond to that. So I think we've got a big job to do. But without doubt, I don't underestimate that if the government was to make the wrong political choices, and we see the same kind of industrial vandalism that we saw in the 1980s, and what that does to, you know, local towns, what that does to high streets, what that does to people's fears and worries about the future, then, you know, it is fertile ground for the rise of the far right. And I think there is a very, very big moral and political responsibility on all of us to do everything within our power to fight it.
I'm going to leave the last word to Gordon Brown, reminding him that he was indeed one of the architects of a new progressive politics in this country 3 decades and more ago, New Labour, which laid the foundation for 3 successive election victories. So 3 decades on, in the middle of a pandemic and with full Brexit looming just a few months away, what should the new centre-left stand for?
Well, equality, fairness, decent wages, far better public services. There is so much to fight for now. When I was listening to this, I was thinking, why are the government unfreezing dividend payments for people who are virtually millionaires and freezing the pay of people, the millions of low-paid workers in this country? There's got to be fairness in any debate, as Olaf has said, about the future. We've got to be talking about a fairer society. But I think we've got to realize that, you know, free trade must be fair trade. That there has to be some control over capital movements where they're not working to the benefit of people and destabilizing economies. That we have to recognize that the trade-off between inflation and unemployment is very different now, and therefore we've got to pursue, and I think the Bank of England should have a dual mandate to pursue policies of full employment as well as dealing with inflation. So there's a lot of changes if we're going to come to terms with this new global economy that we have to make. One example, you asked about inequality. I mean, we tried in 2009 in the G20 to deal with this problem of tax havens, because as long as money can flow out of the country free of tax, then people will see a basic unfairness in the tax system. We had an argument between 2 different countries, one who wanted action, one who didn't. We've got to move that argument forward, and we've got to repatriate to countries the revenues that are being lost, that should be paying for the health service and should be paying for education, that are at the moment being siphoned off by people who ought to understand that they have got a contribution to make by paying fair taxes. So there is international action and national action. We've got to rebuild the social contract, and we've got to build, again, international cooperation.
Thank you, Gordon. And I, like Olaf, am surely watching with bated breath to watch the government's post-Brexit tax policy and tax competition in Europe. But on that note, can I thank Olaf Scholz, Francis O'Grady, Lisa Nandy, and of course, Gordon Brown, for what I hope was a fruitful discussion at a time of great test for our country. Thank you.
Thank you.